Eleanor Brooks had sewn her dignity into every stitch of that veil, and they cut it apart with a smile. On the morning she was supposed to become a Whitmore, the Whitmore sisters made sure she never would. If this story of betrayal, courage, and justice moves something inside you, subscribe to this channel, follow Eleanor's story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The shears hit the floor before Eleanor even understood what had happened. One moment she had been standing at the window of the Highfield Manor guest chamber, smoothing the last fold of ivory lace between her fingers. The summer heat pressed against the glass like something alive. Outside, carriages were already rolling up the gravel path, bringing Boston's finest families to witness the union of Nathaniel Whitmore and Eleanor Brooks, the shipping heir, and the carpenter's daughter, the marble hall, and the modest coastal home. She had told herself for months that none of that mattered. She had been wrong. The door opened without a knock. Victoria Whitmore entered first, tall, polished, wearing a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Behind her came Caroline, younger by 3 years, but identical in the way that mattered most, the particular cruelty that lived behind good manners. They moved like women who had never once in their lives been asked to wait. "We came to see how the preparations were progressing," Victoria said, glancing around the chamber, the way a woman glances at a room she intends to redecorate. Eleanor turned from the window. She kept her voice even. "Everything is in order, Victoria. Thank you." "Is it—" Caroline moved toward the dressing table, trailing her fingers along the wood. "You've certainly been busy." Eleanor didn't answer. She had learned in the months since Nathaniel had brought her to Highfield that silence was the safest response to Caroline's tone. Anything else became ammunition. Victoria had already crossed the room. She was standing over the veil. Eleanor had laid it carefully across the back of the chair, spread open, so the full expanse of antique Honiton lace could breathe in the summer air before she pinned it. 8 months of work lived in that fabric. 8 months of candlelight and magnifying glass and hands steady as a surgeon's, coaxing each broken thread back into position, reinforcing what time and neglect had destroyed. The veil had come to her in fragments. She had returned it to wholeness. She had thought that was what the Whitmores wanted. She had been wrong about that, too. "It's quite old," Victoria said, not a compliment. "It belonged to Nathaniel's grandmother," Eleanor said carefully. "He asked me to restore it for the ceremony. I've spent the better part of—" "I know what it is." Victoria turned to look at her. "And I know what you are." The room changed. Something in the air shifted the way air shifts before lightning finds the ground. Eleanor took one step forward. "Victoria, you are a carpenter's daughter from Salem who convinced my brother that skill is the same thing as breeding." Victoria's voice remained perfectly pleasant. "It isn't. It never will be. And this wedding—" She gestured at the chamber, the gown on the stand, the veil on the chair, "is the single greatest mistake this family has ever made." "That is not your decision," Eleanor said quietly. "No." Victoria agreed. "It isn't." She picked up the shears from the dressing table. Eleanor did not understand immediately. The human mind protects itself that way, refuses the unbearable, until it is already done. The sound was what broke through. That tearing, shrieking sound of antique lace under cold iron. One long, deliberate cut from crown to hem. And then another. And then Caroline's hands joining in, pulling, separating, unraveling in seconds what Eleanor had spent 8 months rebuilding thread by thread. "Stop!" The word came out of Eleanor like a wound. "Stop, stop, stop." She crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed Victoria's wrist. Victoria looked down at Eleanor's hand on her arm, as if a sparrow had landed on her sleeve. "Remove your hand," she said, "or I will have you removed from this property before my brother even knows you've gone." Eleanor did not remove her hand. For one long, suspended moment, they stood exactly like that. The silk merchant's daughter and the carpenter's daughter, both holding the remains of something irreplaceable between them. Then Eleanor looked down. The veil was in pieces. Not damaged, not torn. Pieces. fragments scattered across the floorboards, like the remains of something that had never had a chance. She released Victoria's wrist. She knelt on the floor without meaning to. Her knees simply gave the way a person's body sometimes makes a decision before the mind catches up. Her hands moved through the pieces of lace. She found the section she had spent 11 days repairing, a 6-inch span near the crown where the original thread had been so fragile she'd had to work under a glass by lamplight. Her breath held her needle moving slower than time. It was in 4 pieces now. 5. 8 months, she said to the floor. Pity, said Caroline. We'll tell Nathaniel it was an accident, Victoria said, smoothing her sleeve where Eleanor had gripped it. These things happen with old fabric, terribly fragile, you understand. Eleanor looked up at them. Later, in the long aftermath of that summer day, she would try to name what she felt in that moment. People expected her to say rage. They expected grief. What she actually felt was something colder and more clarifying than either. Something that had no clean name in the English language of 1815, but that a woman of any century would recognize instantly. It was the feeling of finally understanding exactly who you are dealing with. Get out, Eleanor said. Excuse me? Caroline's eyebrows rose. Get. Eleanor rose from the floor. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Out of this room. Victoria tilted her head. This is our house, Miss Brooks. You don't have the authority to. The authority I have, gay, Eleanor said, is the authority of a woman with nothing left to lose in this room, and I strongly suggest you test it somewhere else. Something in her voice, or perhaps her eyes, gave even Victoria Whitmore a moment's pause. They left. Not hurrying, not afraid, but they left. And Eleanor stood alone in the summer heat with 8 months of destroyed work at her feet and a wedding beginning in 4 hours. She did not cry immediately. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the pieces of lace on the floor, and thought in a strange, removed way about the woman whose hands had first made that veil. Nathaniel's grandmother, Margaret Whitmore, born Margaret Colby in 1761, married at 19, widowed at 43. Eleanor knew her only through the object she'd left behind. But she'd come to know her well in the way a conservator always comes to know the maker of a thing, through the particular choices made in construction. The individual tension of each stitch, the small imperfections that revealed the human being behind the craft. Margaret Whitmore had been a precise woman. Careful. Someone who measured twice and cut once, who did not waste thread or time. Eleanor had felt a kinship with her across 50 years of separation. And now the last physical trace of Margaret Whitmore's skill lay scattered across a floorboard, because her granddaughters had decided Eleanor Brooks did not deserve to wear it. Eleanor picked up every piece. She didn't know why exactly. There was no practical reason. The lace was beyond repair, now beyond anything but the most painstaking and time-consuming reconstruction that could take another year. But she gathered each fragment anyway, folding them into the cloth bag she kept her tools in, pressing them together as if that mattered. It did matter. She couldn't have explained why, but it did. Nathaniel came at 9:30. She heard his footsteps in the hall, that particular measured stride she had come to know. The way you come to know any sound you live with long enough. She had spent a full year learning the rhythms of this house, which floorboards announced visitors, which door hinges needed oil where the kitchen staff gathered at noon, and what their laughter sounded like when it was genuine versus performed for the family's benefit. She had paid attention to everything. She had missed the thing that mattered most. He knocked twice. She didn't answer. He opened the door anyway, which was, she thought, an entire education in itself. Nathaniel Whitmore was a handsome man, in the particular way that privilege produces clean lines, and easy bearing, the confidence of someone who had never had to fight for a room's attention, because rooms had always simply rearranged themselves for him. He was not a bad man. Eleanor had spent considerable time deciding this, and she still believed it. He was not bad. He was something more dangerous than bad. He was weak in exactly the ways that counted. He looked at her. He looked at the floor where the lace had been. She watched him understand what had happened, watched it move across his face in sequence, the way weather moves across open water. Then he said, "Eleanor, don't," she said. He stopped. "I know what happened," he said after a moment. "Do you?" "Victoria told me it was an accident, that the veil—" "Nathaniel." Eleanor turned from the window to face him directly. "Look at me and tell me you believe that." A silence. Outside, somewhere on the grounds, a horse shifted and stamped. The summer heat pressed in through the glass. A woman's laugh floated up from the garden below, where the early guests were already gathering, already sipping lemonade, and discussing the morning's social particulars. "It doesn't matter what I believe," Nathaniel said finally. "What matters is that in—" He checked his watch. 3.5 hours, the most important families in Boston are going to be in that cathedral. "My family's name." "Your family's name," Eleanor repeated. "I didn't mean it that way." "Which way did you mean it?" He came further into the room. She watched him settle into what she recognized as his persuasion posture, shoulders slightly forward, voice lowered to something intimate and reasonable. She had fallen for that posture once, more than once. "Eleanor, I need you to be calm today. I need you to—" "They destroyed an irreplaceable object," she said, "a piece of your own family's history. And you came up here to ask me to be calm. I came up here to ask you not to make this into something it doesn't need to be." The words landed with precision. Not cruelty. Nathaniel had never been deliberately cruel. Just the quiet, comfortable certainty of a man who had always had the luxury of deciding what things needed to be. "It doesn't need to be anything other than what it already is," Eleanor said. "Your sisters destroyed the veil." "We don't know that, Nathaniel." Her voice went flat. "Don't." Another silence. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, and the genuine helplessness in his voice nearly broke something in her because it was real. He genuinely didn't know. He had been raised in a world where the women around him resolved their own conflicts while the men of the family waited for the dust to settle, and he had never once questioned whether that arrangement was acceptable. "What I want," Eleanor said slowly, "is for you to walk back downstairs, tell your sisters what they did was unconscionable, and then come back up here and tell me you stand with me, whatever comes after." He looked at her. She looked at him. She already knew the answer. She had known it before the words were fully out of her mouth. But she needed to hear it from him, needed that particular truth to be spoken out loud in the summer heat of a chamber that smelled of lilac water and destroyed lace, so that she could not in some weaker moment later pretend she hadn't known. "They're my family," he said. 2 words, 4 syllables. "Everything." "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "They are." He left to go prepare for the ceremony. Neptor. She stood at the window for a long time after his footsteps faded. The grounds of Highfield Manor stretched out below her in the full, indifferent beauty of a Massachusetts summer morning. The elm trees stood in their rows along the south lawn. The flower beds were in full color, violet and gold and white, tended by hands that were not the Whitmore sisters' hands maintained by labor that the Whitmore family paid for and never thought about. Eleanor had thought about it. She always thought about things like that. Her father had been a carpenter. Thomas Brooks, a man who could read the grain of a piece of oak, the way some men read faces who had built things meant to last, because he believed the world deserved things that lasted. Her mother had been a schoolteacher in Salem, Massachusetts, a woman who had taught Eleanor to read Latin at 8, and to hold her opinions with confidence at 12, and to know the difference between the world as it was and the world as it ought to be. From neither of them had she inherited the ability to simply accept that the two were identical. She opened the cloth bag on the bed. She spread the pieces of the veil out on the white coverlet. She looked at them for a long time. And then slowly, with hands that had learned steadiness from 8 months of work, that no one in this house had ever truly seen, she began to arrange them. Not to repair. Not in 4 hours, not in 4 days, but to understand. Because Eleanor Brooks had spent her life learning that things broken apart still held information. A torn textile still carried its maker's intentions in every fiber. A destroyed object still told its story often more clearly than an intact one, because destruction reveals the points of construction that beauty conceals. The veil in pieces told her exactly how it had been made, and it told her something else. Something that made her go very still at the edge of the bed. She lifted a fragment toward the light from the window. A section from the lower hem, the part she had left largely unrestored, because the original construction there had been so fine, she hadn't wanted to risk disturbing it. She had catalogued it, photographed it in her working notes, noted the thread count and the unusual weight of the lace. There was a marking along the inner edge. She had noted it before, assumed it was a conservator's mark from an earlier restoration attempt. Tiny letters worked into the lace itself invisible, unless you knew to look for them and had the right angle of light. She tilted the fragment. D.M. Federal Collection. 1809. Eleanor sat very still. Her knowledge of American history was not the kind taught in fashionable Boston drawing rooms. It was the kind accumulated by a woman who had spent her professional life caring for objects, which meant caring also for the histories those objects carried. She knew what those initials stood for. She knew what a federal collection marking from 1809 indicated. She knew what this meant, and she understood, sitting in the summer heat with destroyed lace in her hands, that the Whitmore sisters had just done something far larger than destroying a veil. They had destroyed a piece of the United States government. The clock on the mantelpiece read 10:45. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Eleanor set the fragment carefully with the others. She folded her hands in her lap. She breathed in through the nose, out through the mouth, the rhythm her mother had taught her for moments, when emotion threatened to outrun thought. Then she stood crossed to the writing desk in the corner of the chamber and began to compose a letter. She wrote quickly, but precisely. No wasted words. Her father's daughter in that, at least. She described the marking, the fragment, the provenance of the object as she understood it. She described what had happened to it. She included the date, the location, the full names of the individuals involved. She sealed the letter. She rang for the housemaid, a young woman named Della, who had always treated Eleanor with simple, uncomplicated courtesy, which Eleanor had noticed and quietly appreciated. "Della," she said when the girl appeared, "I need this delivered to the federal marshal's office on State Street. Not tomorrow, not this afternoon. Now. This morning before noon." Della looked at the letter, then at Eleanor, then at the letter again. "Ma'am," she said, "the ceremony will happen or it won't," Eleanor said quietly. "But this letter goes first. Will you take it?" A pause. Della was 17, maybe 18, young enough to be uncertain, old enough to read a room. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "I'll take it myself." "Thank you." Eleanor pressed the letter into her hands. "Take the south gate. Don't let the family see you go." After Della left, Eleanor turned back to the window. The grounds were filling now. More carriages, more voices. The Whitmore wedding was Boston's social event of the summer merchants and magistrates, shipping men and their wives, the full weight of the city's elite arriving in their finest to witness a union that Victoria Whitmore had just spent the morning trying to prevent. Eleanor looked at the pieces of the veil spread across the white coverlet. She made a decision, not with rage, not with desperation. With something quieter and more absolute, the particular certainty that arrives when a person stops hoping someone else will do what is right and understands finally that they will have to do it themselves. She was going to that ceremony. She was going to wear what remained of the veil, not because she was still marrying Nathaniel Whitmore. She had known the answer to that question from the moment she watched him look at the floor and choose his family's comfort over her dignity. She was going because a wrong had been done in this house, a wrong larger than a wedding, larger than a family's social position, larger than one woman's broken heart, and someone had to stand in the place where the wrong had happened and refuse to let it be covered over with pretty manners and polite fiction. That was what her mother had taught her justice meant, not a verdict handed down from above, a witness who refused to leave the room. She gathered the fragments of the veil. She folded them into a length of muslin with the care of someone preparing sacred things for transport. She dressed herself without the help of the chambermaid, buttoned each button with steady hands, pinned her hair without looking in the mirror, put on the white gloves she had brought from Salem and the shoes she had saved 3 months to purchase. She placed the bundled veil under her arm. She opened the door of the chamber, and Eleanor Brooks walked into the hall of Highfield Manor on the morning of the day that was supposed to be her wedding day, with nothing left to lose, and the entire truth of the situation pressed against her chest like a shield. Down the hall, she could hear Victoria's voice carrying assured performing graciousness for early arriving guests. She kept walking. She had a cathedral to get to, and the truth had a way of arriving exactly when it was needed most. Eleanor did not take the main staircase. She had learned in the months she had lived inside Highfield Manor that the main staircase was a performance space. Every step visible from the entrance hall below, every movement observed and catalogued by whoever happened to be standing in the right position. The Whitmore family used that staircase the way other families used calling cards, as a statement of arrival, an announcement of presence, a declaration that you belonged to the house and the house belonged to you. Eleanor had never belonged to this house. She took the servants' stair. It ran along the east wall of the manor, narrow and plain, its treads worn smooth by years of feet that no guest had ever thought to notice. She moved quickly, the bundled veil pressed against her side, her shoes soundless on the wood. From somewhere below came the sound of silverware being arranged. The kitchen staff preparing for the wedding breakfast that was supposed to follow the ceremony. The smell of summer heat and beeswax and something baked with cinnamon reached her through the walls. She stopped at the bottom of the stair. The door to the kitchen passage was 6 inches from her hand. Through it she could hear Della's voice, sharp, urgent, talking to someone. And then another voice lower that Eleanor didn't immediately recognize. She pushed the door open. Della was standing at the kitchen table, with her hat already on, and Eleanor's sealed letter gripped in both hands. Across from her stood William, the Whitmore family's head groundskeeper, a barrel-chested man in his 50s who had worked the estate for 30 years, and had, in Eleanor's experience, eyes that saw everything, and a mouth that volunteered nothing. They both looked at her when she entered. "Miss Brooks," William said, not startled, just acknowledging. "William." Eleanor looked at the letter in Della's hands, then at him. "Were you going to stop her?" "No, ma'am." He said it simply, without apology or elaboration. "I was going to take her. The south gates watched this morning. Mr. Whitmore's man Jessup has been on it since 7. I know the back way out through the orchard that Jessup don't." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "Why?" she asked. William reached up and adjusted his hat brim, the way a man does when he's choosing words carefully. "Because I worked for the Whitmore family 30 years, he said, and I worked for their grandmother Margaret before that. And I know what that veil was, ma'am. I saw it brought out once when Mrs. Margaret was still living. And I know what was done to it this morning because I know the sound of scissors through silk." He paused. "Some things deserve better than what this family gives them." Eleanor held his gaze. "Take Della through the orchard," she said. "Get that letter to State Street before noon." "Yes, ma'am." "And William—" He stopped at the door. "Thank you." He nodded once, the same economical acknowledgement he'd given everything else, and then he and Della were gone through the back of the kitchen and into the summer morning. Eleanor stood alone in the kitchen passage, and then she squared her shoulders, tucked the bundled veil more firmly under her arm, and walked toward the sound of Victoria Whitmore's voice. The front parlor of Highfield Manor was the room where the family received guests, and on this particular morning it had become something close to a command center. Victoria held the center of it as naturally as a general holds a battlefield, stationed near the tall windows directing the flow of early arrivals with the precision of long practice. Her gown was pale blue silk, her hair arranged with the kind of artful casualness that required 2 hours and a skilled maid. She looked as she always looked, like a woman for whom the world had been specifically organized. Caroline was near the fireplace talking to a group of 3 women. Eleanor half-recognized wives of shipping associates she thought, judging by the quality of their fabric and the particular way they held their teacups. Nathaniel was not in the room. Eleanor stood in the parlor doorway and understood in the space of about 4 seconds exactly what was happening. Victoria had already told the story. She could see it in the way the three women near Caroline glanced toward the door and then quickly away, the reflexive avoidance of people who have just been discussing someone who has then walked into the room. She could see it in the slight tension that moved through Victoria's shoulders before Victoria turned, composed herself, and produced a smile like a weapon drawn from a scabbard. "Eleanor," Victoria said warmly. "There you are. We were beginning to wonder." "Were you?" Eleanor said. She walked into the room. She did not hurry. She did not slow. She moved at exactly the pace she had decided upon in the kitchen passage. Steady, unhurried, the pace of a woman who has made a decision and no longer requires anyone's permission to carry it out. The three women near Caroline had stopped talking. "I heard you had some trouble with the veil," said one of them. A Mrs. Hargrove. Eleanor now placed her wife of a merchant who dealt in New England shipping routes. Her voice was careful, the particular careful of someone who wants information without appearing to seek it. "Yes," Eleanor said pleasantly. "I did." A beat of silence. "Terribly fragile old lace," Mrs. Hargrove offered. "Terribly," Eleanor agreed. "Particularly when someone put scissors to it." The air in the room changed the way it had changed in the bridal chamber that morning, that particular pressure drop before something breaks. Victoria's smile didn't flicker. 30 years of Boston society had trained it into something beyond facial expression, more like structural feature, load-bearing, weight-distributing. "Eleanor," she said, her voice carrying the gentle warning of a woman used to being heated, "I think perhaps you should rest before the ceremony. It's been an emotional morning." "It has," Eleanor said, "but I'm not tired." She looked around the parlor with the same careful attention she brought to everything: the placement of people, the arrangement of furniture, the small territorial markers that told her who in this room was whose and how the allegiances were arranged. Then she looked at Caroline. Caroline, to her credit, met Eleanor's eyes without looking away. She was better at this than Eleanor had initially given her credit for, better at the performance of innocence, better at holding a steady expression when the ground shifted underneath her. "Caroline," Eleanor said, "would you like to tell Mrs. Hargrove what happened to the veil this morning since you were there?" Silence like a stone dropped in still water. "I don't know what you mean," Caroline said. "I think you do." "Eleanor." Nathaniel's voice came from the doorway behind her. She turned. He was standing in the hall just outside the parlor entrance in his wedding clothes, dark coat, white cravat, the polished composure of a man who had been preparing for this day for months, and was now watching it move in a direction he hadn't anticipated. Behind him stood two more guests, a couple Eleanor didn't know who had clearly arrived at an unfortunate moment and were now frozen in the hallway, trying to decide whether to advance or retreat. "Can we speak privately?" Nathaniel said. His voice was low, controlled, doing the work of keeping the morning manageable. "I think we've spoken privately enough this morning," Eleanor said. "Don't you?" The couple in the hallway made the decision to retreat. They did it quietly, backing away, with the careful footwork of people removing themselves from a situation they hadn't been invited into. Nathaniel stepped into the parlor. "Eleanor." He came toward her, not threatening, just closing the distance, trying to make this smaller and more contained. "I understand you're upset, Nathaniel," Eleanor said quietly, and there was something in her voice that stopped him. Not volume, not anger. Something beneath both of those, a fundamental steadiness that had not been there that morning when she'd knelt on the floor picking up fragments of lace. "I need you to hear me, not manage me. Hear me." He stopped. "Your sisters destroyed the veil. We've been through—" "They destroyed it deliberately," Eleanor said, "with scissors they brought into the bridal chamber for that specific purpose. And you came to my room and asked me to be calm about it. And now you're here asking me to speak privately, which is another way of asking me to be calm about it in a different room." Victoria moved. Just slightly, a repositioning, that brought her one step closer to Nathaniel, one step further into the geometry of family solidarity. Eleanor saw it. She suspected everyone in the room saw it. "You need to think about what you're doing," Victoria said to Eleanor, and the warmth had left her voice entirely now, replaced by something clear and cold and honest, which Eleanor found perversely much easier to deal with than the warmth had been. "You are a guest in this house. You have been welcomed into this family against the better judgment of everyone in it, and you are standing here in front of people who matter to our family's name and business and social standing, making accusations that you cannot." "I can prove," Eleanor said. Victoria stopped. "I have documentation of the veil's provenance," Eleanor said. 8 months of conservation notes, photographs, daguerreotype prints, made at the beginning of the restoration process and at intervals throughout. Measurements, thread analysis, a full record of the object's condition when it came to me and the work I did on it. She paused. "And I have a marking I found this morning, along the inner hem, which I documented last night as part of my final assessment before the ceremony." The room was very quiet. "A marking," Victoria repeated. "A provenance mark," Eleanor said. "The kind applied by a federal archivist, with initials and a collection date." She watched the color leave Caroline's face. It was not a dramatic thing, not a swoon, not a gasp, none of the theatrical responses that drawing-room novels had taught women to perform. It was the quiet, involuntary pallor of a person whose body has understood the implications of something before the mind has fully caught up. Victoria did not pale. Victoria was too well trained for that. But something shifted behind her eyes, a rapid, invisible reassessment. The calculation of a woman who has just realized the board is not arranged the way she thought. "I don't know what you think you found," Victoria said carefully. "I know what I found," Eleanor said. "I spent 8 months with that object. I know every inch of it." "You're making a scene," Nathaniel said, and his voice had a quality Eleanor hadn't heard from him before. Not authority, not even persuasion, but something closer to a plea. "Eleanor, please. The guests." "We'll have something to talk about," Eleanor said quietly. "Either way." She left the parlor. Not running, not retreating. She walked out the same way she had walked in, at the pace she had decided on, steady and deliberate, with the bundled veil under her arm, and her head at the angle her mother had insisted upon since Eleanor was 12 years old, and had first begun to understand that the world would spend considerable energy trying to make her look down. She walked through the entrance hall and out the front door, and down the steps of Highfield Manor into the full white heat of the Massachusetts summer morning. The grounds were busy now. Carriages arriving and departing, stable hands moving horses, guests in their summer finery, making their way across the lawn toward the garden terrace where lemonade and light refreshments had been arranged. Voices and laughter and the particular bright chatter of people who had come to celebrate something and had not yet learned there was nothing to celebrate. Eleanor found a bench at the edge of the south lawn, half in the shade of an elm tree, and sat down. She opened the muslin bundle in her lap. She spread the fragments of the veil across her knees and began slowly and methodically to arrange them in order crowned to hem the sequence of the original construction. Not repairing, just organizing, bearing witness to what it had been. She heard footsteps approach and stop. She did not look up. "Miss Brooks." The voice was unfamiliar, female, older than Caroline's, younger than Victoria's, somewhere in the register of a woman in her mid-40s, who had spent those years developing an opinion and the vocabulary to express it. Eleanor looked up. The woman standing in front of her was someone she'd seen before, at the edges of Whitmore social events, always slightly outside the primary circles, always watching more than she spoke. Medium height, a face that had once been conventionally pretty, and had become with time something more interesting than that. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced," Eleanor said. "Margaret Aldrich," the woman said. "My husband has business dealings with Nathaniel's father's estate." She sat down on the bench beside Eleanor without being invited, which immediately raised Eleanor's estimation of her. "May I look?" Eleanor held out a fragment. Margaret Aldrich took it with careful hands, the hands of someone who knew how to hold fragile things. She examined it in the light. Then she looked at Eleanor. "How long did it take you?" she asked. 8 months. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then, "I heard what happened, inside." She meant the parlor. "Half the house heard, I suspect." "Good," Eleanor said. A beat of surprise, then quietly, "Good." Margaret Aldrich set the fragment back carefully among the others. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to the ceremony," Eleanor said. "With the veil." "With what's left of it." Margaret looked at her steadily. "Victoria will not forgive you for this." "Victoria shredded 8 months of my work this morning," Eleanor said. "I'm not especially concerned with Victoria's forgiveness." "And Nathaniel?" Eleanor arranged a fragment of lace along her knee. She looked at it for a moment. "Nathaniel made his choice this morning," she said. "He came to my room and told me in the politest possible terms that what his sisters had done to me was less important than how I responded to it. That is a thing a person can only say once." Margaret Aldrich was quiet. Around them, the wedding guests continued to move across the Highfield grounds, oblivious and celebratory, and entirely unaware that the event they had come to witness had already fundamentally changed its shape. "You sent a letter," Margaret said. "Not a question." Eleanor looked at her sharply. "William is an old friend," Margaret said simply. "His daughter worked in my kitchen for 3 years. He sent word." Eleanor considered this for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I sent a letter." "To the federal marshal's office." "Yes." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. She looked at the pieces of the veil. "My husband was an archivist," she said quietly, "before he went into commerce. He would have given everything he had to work on something like that." She paused. "He'd have been furious." "So am I," Eleanor said. "I know." Margaret stood. "I'll be at the cathedral, Miss Brooks. Whatever happens, I'll be there." She walked back toward the manor without another word. Eleanor watched her go. Then she looked back at the pieces in her lap, and she thought about the letter moving through the summer morning toward State Street. And she thought about what would happen when it arrived, and she thought about what she was about to do. And she was afraid. She wanted to be honest about that, at least here, at least alone on this bench in the elm shade, while the wedding guests chattered around her and the world prepared to witness something it didn't yet understand. She was afraid the letter would arrive too late. She was afraid she'd misread the marking. She was afraid that she would stand in that cathedral and speak the truth and be met with the particular silence that the powerful use to erase the inconvenient. She folded the fragments back into the muslin. She was going anyway. Fear was information. It was not instruction. By noon, the quality of the crowd at Highfield Manor had changed. Eleanor noticed it when she came back inside to collect the last of her things from the bridal chamber. The people who filled the entrance hall and the parlor and the wide summer garden were no longer simply guests at a wedding. They were participants in a story, most of them unaware of the story's actual shape, but sensing through some social instinct that something unusual was in the air. Whispers had a different sound than ordinary conversation, a different rhythm. Eleanor had grown up among schoolteachers and craftsmen, people who worked with their hands and their minds, and were therefore precise about the difference between what they knew and what they suspected. But even she could feel the particular charge in the manor's air that meant information was moving, mutating, finding new shapes as it passed from mouth to ear. She passed through the entrance hall without stopping. She heard her name once clearly from somewhere to her left. She did not turn. On the main staircase, the performance staircase, the announcement staircase, she encountered Caroline. They saw each other at the same moment. Caroline was coming down. Eleanor was going up, and there was no polite way to avoid the meeting on the wide middle landing where the staircase turned. Caroline stopped. Eleanor stopped. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Below the entrance hall, sounds continued: voices, footsteps, the distant clink of glassware from the kitchen. Above, the upper hallway was empty and quiet. "You shouldn't do this," Caroline said finally. Her voice was different from what it had been in the parlor, smaller. Something had gone out of it, not the arrogance entirely, but the sureness that underlay it, the bedrock assumption that the world would arrange itself in her favor if she insisted firmly enough. "Caroline," Eleanor said, "you put scissors to 8 months of my work. It was just—" "Don't say fabric," Eleanor said quietly. "Please don't say fabric." Caroline's mouth closed. That veil was the last thing Margaret Whitmore made with her own hands before she died, Eleanor said. "Your grandmother. Nathaniel's grandmother. A woman who spent her life building something worth inheriting." She paused. "You destroyed it." "We were trying to—" Caroline stopped herself. "I know what you were trying to do," Eleanor said. "You were trying to make me leave. You thought that if you took away the one thing I had prepared for this day, the one object that connected me to this family's actual history, I would crumble." She looked at Caroline steadily. "I didn't crumble." Caroline looked away. "There are going to be consequences," Eleanor said. Not as a threat, as a statement of fact, delivered with the same directness she brought to conservation work. Here is what the evidence shows, here is what it means, here is what follows. Not because I want them for you, but because what you did this morning was larger than either of us, and I think you know that now." Caroline said nothing. Eleanor continued up the stairs. The bridal chamber was empty when she reached it. Someone had tidied a maid she supposed instructed by Victoria to remove the evidence of the morning. The floor had been swept. The dressing table was clear. Even the chair where the veil had been laid was positioned differently, as if rearranging the furniture could rearrange what had happened in front of it. Eleanor had expected this. She had taken her conservation notes with her when she left that morning. 8 months of careful documentation, dates, measurements, photographs, observations, folded into the leather satchel she had brought from Salem and never left behind. The satchel was where it always was, underneath the bed, in the one location she had confirmed early in her time at Highfield that the housemaids did not sweep. She pulled it out. She sat on the edge of the bed with the satchel across her knees and thought carefully and specifically about everything she knew and everything she could prove. The marking along the inner hem, D.M. Federal Collection, 1809, Dolly Madison. It could only be Dolly Madison. The initials, the date, the timeline fitted. Eleanor had spent enough time in the records of the federal government's early cultural acquisitions through her own research work to know that 1809 was the year the first formal collection of historical American domestic textiles had been assembled under the direction of the First Lady's office. A collection that had been partially dispersed, partially lost, partially, in the deliberate euphemism of the official records she had read, unaccounted for. The Whitmore family had acquired the veil somewhere between 1809 and the present day. Eleanor did not know how. She did not need to know how. That was the federal marshal's work, not hers. Her work was to ensure the truth did not disappear with the fabric. She added 3 pages of notes to her documentation. Everything from that morning recorded in the same precise date-stamped factual language she applied to all her conservation work. What she had seen. What had been said. Who had been present. What she had found in the fragments, and when, and at what angle of light. She closed the satchel. She stood. She crossed to the window one last time and looked out at the grounds of Highfield Manor, the carriages and the guests and the elm trees and the summer sky, that particular shade of late-morning Massachusetts blue that looked from inside a house like this, like a painting of the world, rather than the world itself. She picked up the bundled veil. She picked up the satchel. She did not look back at the bridal chamber as she left it. In the carriage house behind the manor, she found what she'd hoped to find, one of the hired coaches still waiting its driver on the box reading a pamphlet. He looked up when she approached. Young man not yet 30, with an uncomplicated face and the cautious alertness of someone accustomed to picking up social cues from strangers. "Are you engaged for this afternoon?" Eleanor asked. "Hired through the evening, ma'am," he said, "for the wedding party." "I need to go to St. Matthew's Cathedral," she said, "before the main party arrives." He looked at her, her dress, her satchel, the bundle under her arm. "The wedding's not until 2. he said. I know, Eleanor said. I need to be there first. He thought about it for a moment, the particular hesitation of a working man weighing a request that was unusual, but not on its face unreasonable. Get in, ma'am, he said. She got in. The carriage moved down the Highfield Drive and through the summer morning away from the manor with its whispers and its tidied floors, and its family that had made its choices toward the cathedral, where in 2 hours all of Boston's quality would assemble to witness a wedding. Eleanor sat with the bundled veil in her lap and her satchel at her feet and her hands folded on top of them both, and she breathed in through the nose, out through the mouth, and she thought about nothing except what she was going to do when she got there. She had stopped hoping someone would save her. She had started doing it herself. St. Matthew's Cathedral stood on the corner of Park and Tremont, its stone face weathered by 30 years of Boston winters and summers alike. Eleanor had been inside once before, when Nathaniel had brought her for a preliminary meeting with the minister about the ceremony. She had paid attention, then had noticed the nave's proportions, the placement of the pews, the way sound moved in the space, the sight lines from the altar back toward the main doors. She had paid attention because she always paid attention. The cathedral was quiet when she arrived. The minister, a careful-faced man named Reverend Coates, was at the front of the nave with 2 assistants arranging flowers at the altar rail. He looked up when Eleanor walked in. "Miss Brooks," he said, with the particular tone of a man who is trying to determine which of several possible situations he is in. "Reverend Coates?" She came down the center aisle. "I need to speak with you before the ceremony." "Of course." He handed his flower arrangement to an assistant and came toward her. "Is everything all right?" "No," Eleanor said simply. "It is not. But it will be once the right people know the right things." She opened the satchel. She spread her documentation on the nearest pew, and for the next 45 minutes, while Boston prepared itself to celebrate a wedding, Eleanor Brooks laid out 8 months of conservation work and 1 morning of deliberate destruction, piece by piece in language so precise and evidence so thorough that Reverend Coates, a man who had presided over 30 years of the city's social events and thought he had seen everything those events could produce, sat down in the pew across from her and did not speak for a full 2 minutes after she finished. Then he said, "Lord have mercy." "Indeed," Eleanor said. She began to collect her documents. "I need one more thing from you, Reverend Coates." "What is that?" Eleanor looked at him. "I need you to let me walk down that aisle," she said, wearing what's left of the veil. Another silence. "Miss Brooks," he said carefully, "do you understand what that will start?" Eleanor said. "Yes, I understand exactly what it will start." She held his gaze. Reverend Coates was quiet for a long moment. He was a man of God and a man of Boston society, and those 2 things had lived together in him for 30 years without too much conflict, because 30 years of Boston society had not until this particular summer morning put them directly in opposition. He looked at the documentation spread across the pew. He looked at Eleanor. "The doors open at 1:30, he said finally. "You may be in your position by then." "Thank you," Eleanor said. She began to reassemble the fragments of the veil. Outside, the summer morning was crossing into afternoon. In an hour and a half, the carriages would begin arriving. In 2 hours, the nave would be full. And the truth, quiet and patient, and dressed in destroyed lace, would be standing at the end of the aisle when they got there. The first carriage arrived at St. Matthew's at 20 minutes past 1. Eleanor heard it from the small antechamber off the left side of the nave, where Reverend Coates had installed her with a cup of tea she hadn't touched and a chair she hadn't sat in. She had spent the intervening hour and 15 minutes doing the only thing she knew how to do when her hands needed to occupy themselves, so her mind could work clearly. She had been arranging the fragments of the veil, not repairing. She had said that to herself twice already and meant it both times. There was no repairing what Victoria had done in 4 minutes with a pair of shears. But there was organizing. There was bearing witness to the original construction. And there was one thing more which had occurred to her about 20 minutes after Reverend Coates left her alone in the antechamber, and which she had been executing with the focused quiet of a woman who has moved past grief into something more purposeful. She was pinning the fragments, not to each other, to the length of cream muslin she had wrapped them in, using her own conservation pins, the fine brass ones she carried in her satchel and had used for 8 months on the original restoration. She was mounting the pieces the way a curator mounts a damaged artifact for display, showing what it had been, showing what had been done to it, making the destruction itself into evidence that could be read. When she finished, she held it up. It was not a veil anymore, it was a document. Every cut was visible. Every place where the shears had gone through was laid bare, the edges raw and separated, telling the story of a deliberate hand moving, with deliberate intention, through something that had taken a woman's lifetime to create. The original beauty of the lace was still there. You could see it in the surviving sections, in the extraordinary fineness of the work, in the places where Margaret Whitmore's hands had moved with such precision that not even violence could entirely erase what they had made. But you could also see unmistakably what had been done to it. Eleanor set it across the back of the chair. She put on her gloves. She was ready. The first voice she recognized filtering through the antechamber wall from the nave was Victoria's. She would have known it in a crowded market. That particular carrying tone, the vowels of old Boston money, the cadence of a woman who had never once in her life needed to repeat herself because rooms always quieted when she spoke. Victoria had arrived early, which meant she had come ahead of Nathaniel, which meant she was doing what Eleanor had watched her do at every Whitmore social event. She was controlling the environment before the principal players arrived. Eleanor stood very still and listened. Entirely overwrought, as I said. The stress of the preparations. You know how it can be. A murmur of sympathetic response from someone Eleanor didn't place. Nathaniel has been patience itself, of course. That's who he is. Another murmur. We simply hope she'll compose herself before the ceremony. The family has been nothing but welcoming. Eleanor picked up the mounted veil from the chair. She walked to the antechamber door and opened it. But she did not walk into the nave immediately. She stood in the doorway, the narrow side entrance that opened onto the north transept, out of the main sightline of the growing congregation, and she watched. The nave was perhaps a third full. The early arrivals were clustered in the first several rows, the way wedding guests always clustered close enough to see clearly, social enough to be seen. She recognized faces from Highfield's dinner parties, from the occasional gatherings she had attended in Boston's parlors, as Nathaniel's intended. Merchants. Their wives. A judge she had been introduced to once. 2 men she knew by name as shipping associates of the Whitmore estate. Victoria was at the front near the altar rail holding court with the ease of a woman in her natural environment. Carolyn was further back speaking to a group of younger women. She had recovered her composure since the staircase. Her face was arranged back into its usual smooth arrangement, only the slight rigidity of her jaw giving anything away to someone who knew how to look. Nathaniel was not yet present. Reverend Coates was at the altar. He saw Eleanor the moment she appeared in the doorway. Their eyes met across the length of the nave. He gave her a very small nod, the nod of a man who has made a decision he is not entirely at peace with, but intends to honor. Eleanor stepped into the nave. She chose the center aisle. She did not hesitate. She did not look left or right. She walked at her pace, the pace she had decided on, the pace of a woman who has nothing left to manage except the truth. And she carried the mounted veil in both hands, flat and open, the way a person carries something being presented for examination rather than something being worn for ceremony. The quiet spread out from her like a stone dropped in still water. It moved through the pews in rings first. The people nearest the transept entrance, then the rows beyond them, then further a ripple of silenced conversation and turned heads that reached Victoria in perhaps 15 seconds. Victoria turned. Eleanor kept walking. The silence in St. Matthew's Cathedral on a summer afternoon in 1815 was not the silence of reverence. It was the silence of an audience that has just realized the performance is not the one they purchased tickets for. Victoria's composure held. Eleanor had to grant her that it held with the structural integrity of something built to withstand pressure, the composure of a woman who had been trained since girlhood to maintain form under social fire. Her expression did not collapse. Her posture did not change. But her eyes did. Her eyes went immediately to the mounted veil in Eleanor's hands, and Eleanor watched something move through them fast, dark, and calculating before the composure reasserted itself. "Eleanor," Victoria said, projecting pleasantness across the nave with the precision of a stage actor. "What are you doing?" "Walking to the front of the church," Eleanor said. "Forgive me. I believe that's traditional." A sound from the pews, not quite laughter, not quite a gasp. The sound of people unsure what they are watching and unwilling to commit to a response before they know. Eleanor came to a stop 6 feet from Victoria. She held the mounted veil between them. "I'd like you to look at this," she said quietly, not performing for the crowd, speaking directly person to person the way she had always preferred to speak. "I'd like you to look at what you did this morning and tell me again that it was an accident." Victoria's jaw tightened. "This is not the place," she said low and sharp. "You chose the place," Eleanor said. "You chose it when you decided that destroying this object would destroy me, and that I would simply not show up. You chose this place when you assumed I was the kind of woman who disappears when she's supposed to." Around them, the nave had gone absolutely silent. No one moved toward the door. No one spoke. They sat or stood in the fixed attention of people watching something they understand at some instinctive level to be significant, the way a crowd goes quiet, not for spectacle, but for truth. "I don't know what you think that proves," Victoria said. She was still holding herself together. "Remarkable, really." Eleanor found herself in some distant and observational part of her mind, genuinely impressed by the construction of Victoria Whitmore's self-possession, even as she was determined to bring it down. "It proves," Eleanor said, "exactly what it looks like. 8 months of restoration work destroyed in 4 minutes by hands that knew what they were cutting. You can't demonstrate." "I have documentation," Eleanor said. "I have photographs taken at every stage of the restoration. I have measurements, thread analysis condition reports. I have a record of exactly what this object looked like before I began work on it and at every stage of the process." She paused. "And I have the marking." Caroline made a sound. It was small, barely audible, but in the silence of the cathedral, it was as clear as a struck bell. A small, involuntary intake of breath quickly suppressed from a woman who had just heard a specific word she hadn't expected. Several heads turned toward Caroline. Caroline's face had gone through several complicated things in rapid succession, and had landed somewhere that Eleanor recognized as controlled fear, the expression of a person who has been running a calculation in their head and has just arrived at a number they didn't want. "What marking?" said a voice from the pews. Eleanor looked. A man in the 4th row, older, silver-haired, the bearing of someone accustomed to being in rooms where decisions were made. She didn't know his name, but she knew his type, the kind of Boston merchant whose interests were close enough to government affairs that federal matters were not abstract to him. "A provenance mark," Eleanor said, turning to address him directly. "Along the inner hem, applied by a federal archivist, with initials and a collection date." She looked at him steadily. "DM 1809. The silver-haired man went very still. "Good Lord," said someone else quietly from further back. Victoria moved. It was the first uncontrolled movement Eleanor had seen from her, a single step toward Eleanor, quick and unplanned, before she caught herself. "That is a fabrication," she said, and her voice had lost its stage projection. It was flat now, and private, and containing something that Eleanor recognized as the first genuine emotion she had ever heard from Victoria Whitmore that wasn't performed. It was fear. "I don't fabricate," Eleanor said. "I document." The doors at the backs of the cathedral opened. Every head turned. But it was not the marshal. Not yet. It was Nathaniel. He came down the center aisle with the hesitant forward momentum of a man who has been told something on the way into a building and is still processing it. His best man, a tall young man named George Aldrich, whose wife Margaret was Eleanor, now noted already seated 3 rows from the front, was behind him, and behind George were 2 of the younger Whitmore cousins who had been pressed into ceremonial roles. Nathaniel stopped when he saw Eleanor. He looked at her. He looked at the mounted veil. He looked at Victoria. "What?" he began. "I need to speak with you," Victoria said, immediately moving toward him. "Now, before—" "Nathaniel," Eleanor said, and her voice carried clearly in the silence of the nave. He looked at her. "Come and look at this," she said. "Please." Victoria put her hand on his arm. "Nathaniel, do not." "Victoria." His voice was quiet, but something in it made her hand still. He had always been, Eleanor thought, a man capable of firmness when he chose to exercise it. The tragedy was how rarely he chose. He looked at his sister for a moment. Then he walked past her down the aisle to where Eleanor stood. He looked at the mounted veil. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Eleanor watched his face. She watched him understand not the provenance question, not the federal implications, but the simpler and more immediate fact, the evidence of deliberate destruction laid out flat in his intended's hands in front of 60 of Boston's most prominent citizens in the nave of the cathedral, where his wedding was scheduled to begin in 40 minutes. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was low. "I need you to tell me this isn't what it looks like." "I can't tell you that," she said. "Because it is exactly what it looks like." A muscle worked in his jaw. "My sisters made a choice this morning," Eleanor said. "And you made one too when you came to my room. I need you to understand that I'm not standing here because I want to hurt you. I'm standing here because someone has to stand here, and it turned out to be me." He looked at her for a long moment. She saw moving across his face the same sequence she had watched that morning in the bridal chamber, the recognition of what had happened, the reluctance to accept it, the search for a middle position that would allow him to avoid choosing. She had seen it then, and she was seeing it now, and she understood with a clarity that had nothing of cruelty in it that Nathaniel Whitmore was a man who would search for that middle position until the ground ran out beneath him. "Tell me what you want," he said finally. "I want you to tell me," Eleanor said, "in front of these people, whether you believe your sisters destroyed this veil deliberately." Silence. The entire cathedral was holding its breath. Victoria's voice came from behind him. "Nathaniel, do not answer that." He turned to look at his sister. Something passed between them. The compressed private language of a family that has conducted its warfare in drawing rooms and parlors for so long that it has become fluent in saying everything without saying anything. Then he turned back to Eleanor, and she saw the answer on his face before he opened his mouth. "I can't," he began. "Can't or won't," she said. He closed his mouth, and Eleanor, looking at the man she had agreed to marry, felt the last of the complicated, hopeful, foolish thing she had carried for 2 years fold itself up quietly inside her and go still. Not with drama, not with the grand shattering she might have expected. Just the quiet, definitive close of a door. She nodded once. "All right," she said. She turned to face the congregation. 60 pairs of eyes. 60 people who had come for a wedding and found themselves instead in the middle of something considerably more honest. "I apologize for the disruption to your afternoon," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady and clear and carried to the back of the nave without effort. Her mother had taught her how to speak in a room, a schoolteacher's gift, passed daughter to daughter. "I know this is not what any of you expected. It isn't what I expected either when I woke up this morning." No one spoke. No one moved toward the door. "This," she held up the mounted veil, "is what remains of an object I spent 8 months restoring. Honiton lace, mid-18th century, belonging to the Whitmore family by way of origin, that I only this morning understood to be considerably more complicated than anyone in this family acknowledged." She paused. Along the inner hem is a provenance mark that identifies this veil as part of the Federal Heritage Collection assembled in 1809. Which means it was not the Whitmore family's to dispose of, to damage, or to destroy. The silver-haired man in the 4th row stood up. His name, Eleanor would learn later, was Judge Harold Prescott. a circuit court judge with 30 years on the Massachusetts bench, and more relevantly, at this moment, a long-standing connection to federal oversight of cultural property. "Miss Brooks," he said, "are you prepared to substantiate that claim?" "Yes, sir," she said. "I have 8 months of documentation in the satchel at the side door." He looked at her for a moment with the focused assessment of a man whose professional life had consisted of determining who was telling the truth and who was performing it. "Then I suggest," he said carefully, "that we wait." "Wait for what?" said Victoria from behind Nathaniel. Judge Prescott looked at her. "For whoever is coming," he said. "Because if that letter reached State Street before noon, and from the look of things I believe it did, then we will not be waiting long." Victoria's composure, which had held through everything, made its first visible crack. It was a small thing, a slight shift, a fractional tightening around the eyes, a tiny compression of the lips that on anyone else would have been invisible. On Victoria Whitmore, who had not shown an uncontrolled expression in 20 years of Boston social life, it was as loud as a shout. Caroline reached out and took Victoria's arm. Victoria let her. The cathedral fell into a strange, suspended quiet. People did not leave. Eleanor noticed this had half expected the social instinct of self-preservation to empty the pews to send Boston's prominent families out the doors and away from whatever was about to happen inside. But they stayed. They stayed the way people stay when they have understood at some level below rational decision that they are present at something that will be talked about for years. Nathaniel had not moved from where he stood in the center of the aisle. Eleanor was aware of him peripherally. His stillness, his turned-in look, the expression of a man conducting a very rapid and very private reckoning. Margaret Aldrich caught Eleanor's eye from the third row. She gave a single small nod. Eleanor nodded back. Reverend Coates had descended from the altar and was standing at the edge of the chancel steps. His hands folded in front of him, his expression that of a man committed to whatever was coming and at peace with his part in it. Eleanor was grateful to him. She had not asked him to stand anywhere in particular. He had chosen his position himself. The summer afternoon outside pressed through the cathedral's tall windows in long, warm columns. And then Eleanor heard it. Not loud, not yet, but unmistakable to anyone listening, the sound of horses on the cobblestones of Park Street moving fast. The sound of a carriage stopping hard. The sound of feet on stone steps. Victoria heard it too. She turned toward the main doors. For a moment she looked. Eleanor thought genuinely young, stripped of the 30 years of practiced management and social authority, reduced by the sound of boots on cathedral steps, to something closer to a girl who has broken something and is hearing for the first time the footsteps of the person coming to hold her accountable. The doors of St. Matthew's Cathedral opened. The light came in first, the full white summer light of a Massachusetts afternoon, flooding the dim nave, throwing long shadows down the center aisle. And then, in that light, Federal Marshal Caleb Whitaker walked into the church. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself the way men carry themselves when the authority they represent is larger than their physical person, straight, unhurried, occupying exactly the space he needed, and not 1 inch more. He wore the dark coat and badge of his office. Behind him came 2 government agents in plain dress, and behind them, holding the door, was William. William caught Eleanor's eye across the length of the nave. He tipped his hat, just slightly, just once. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. Marshal Whitaker came down the center aisle. He did not look at the congregation. He looked at Eleanor first, a direct assessing look, the kind that was taking inventory rather than making judgments, and then at the mounted veil in her hands. "Miss Eleanor Brooks," he said. "Yes, Marshal," she said. "I received your letter." He came to a stop in front of her. "I'd like to see the marking if you're willing." Eleanor held out the mounted veil. He took it with careful hands. For a long moment, he examined the fragment. She indicated the inner hem, the section with the marking held at the angle she had specified in her letter, because it was the angle at which the stitched letters became legible. His expression did not change, but he went very still. He turned to the agent on his left and said something in a low voice. The agent nodded and moved toward the side door where Eleanor's satchel was. Then Marshal Whitaker turned to face the congregation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. His voice was the voice of a man accustomed to being heard in difficult situations, neither loud nor soft, simply present. "I apologize for the interruption. I'll ask for your patience for a short while longer." He turned specifically to the area where Victoria and Caroline stood. "I'll need to speak with the Whitmore family." "On what authority?" Victoria said. Whitaker looked at her. "Federal authority, ma'am," he said, simply, completely, with the absence of any need to elaborate that was Eleanor thought more devastating than any elaboration could have been. Victoria's hand tightened on Caroline's arm. Nathaniel took one step toward the marshal. "I'd like to understand what's happening," he said. His voice was controlled but barely. "This is my wedding. These are my family. I'd like to know—" "Mr. Whitmore," the marshal said with something that was almost courtesy. "I understand, and I'll explain everything." He paused. "But first, I need to know one thing." He held up the mounted veil. "This object, do you know its history? How it came to your family, who acquired it, and from where?" Nathaniel looked at the veil. For the third time that day, Eleanor watched an answer move across Nathaniel Whitmore's face before he had the chance to manage it. And what she saw was not defiance and not fear and not calculation. It was something she hadn't expected. It was genuine ignorance. He didn't know. Whatever the Whitmore family had done with that veil, however, it had moved from a federal archive to a Whitmore family chest. Nathaniel hadn't known. That truth moved across his face with the involuntary clarity of a man encountering a fact he had not been prepared for. He turned to Victoria. "Victoria," he said, "what did you do?" The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences in that cathedral that afternoon. The others had been the silence of waiting, of tension, of people holding themselves ready for whatever came next. This silence was the silence of arrival of something that had been moving toward this moment for a long time from a distance that made it invisible until now, finally reaching the place it had always been heading. Victoria looked at her brother, and Eleanor, watching Victoria's face in that moment, saw the last wall come down. Not in collapse, not in anything so dramatic as that. Just a settling. The way a very controlled, very careful person eventually settles when they've been holding something too heavy for too long, and the moment arrives when holding it is no longer possible. "Mother knew," Victoria said quietly. "She told us never to speak of it. She said it was an inheritance. She said—" She stopped. Something moved across her face. She said what Grandmother Margaret had always called it was borrowed time. Borrowed time. The phrase landed in the cathedral like a stone. Eleanor thought of Margaret Whitmore, the precise, careful woman she had come to know through 8 months of working with her hands' creation. The woman who measured twice and cut once. Who had stitched a marking into the inner hem of a federal artifact and had lived with it in her home for years, and had called it to herself borrowed time. Had she known what it was? Had she known and kept it anyway? Had she been waiting all those years for the debt to come due? Eleanor would think about that for a long time afterward. There was no clean answer. People were more complicated than clean answers. But she thought she believed from everything she had learned about Margaret Whitmore through the evidence of her hands that the old woman had not been comfortable, that the marking in the inner hem was not an accident, that it was perhaps a kind of confession. A message stitched into the object itself, waiting for the hands careful enough to read it. She had intended for it to be found. Eleanor was sure of that. She looked at the fragments in the marshal's hands and felt for the first time all day something that was not quite grief, and not quite anger, and not quite justice, but contained elements of all three. She felt the weight of what she had been carrying lift not entirely, not cleanly, but enough. Enough to breathe. Marshal Whitaker turned to his agents. "Take the statement," he said, then to Victoria. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me." "You cannot," Caroline began. Caroline. Victoria stopped her. Her voice was quiet now. The performance had ended, and what remained was just a woman standing in a cathedral in the summer light, with the full consequence of a morning's cruelty assembled around her. Don't. She looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in the bridal chamber that morning, with scissors on the floor and 8 months of work scattered like snow. The words between them were already complete. What remained was simply the aftermath. Victoria walked toward the marshal's agent. Caroline, after a moment, followed. Nathaniel stood in the center aisle and watched his sisters go. He did not move to follow them. He did not move to stop them. He stood where he was with the expression of a man standing in the wreckage of a construction he had not built and had not examined, and was only now understanding he had been living inside. He turned to Eleanor. "I didn't know," he said. "I know," she said. "Eleanor." "Nathaniel." Her voice was gentle. It surprised her how gentle it was. She had expected something harder from herself at this moment. But grief, she was learning, did not always look like what you expected. "I know you didn't know about the veil. I believe that. But you knew this morning that your sisters had done something wrong to me, and you chose not to say so. And that," she paused, "that I cannot unknow." He looked at her. She looked at him. And then she looked away at the mounted veil in the marshal's hands, at the light coming through the cathedral windows, at the 60 pairs of eyes that had witnessed the entire afternoon and were now very quiet and very still. She had come to this cathedral to tell the truth. She had told it. What happened next was not her responsibility to manage. She walked to where Marshal Whitaker stood and said, "I have 8 months of documentation in that satchel, sir. All of it is yours." "Thank you, Miss Brooks," he said. He said it the way a man says something he means, not as courtesy, not as formality. As acknowledgement, as the recognition of one person's work by someone with the authority to name what that work was worth. Eleanor stood straight under the weight of it, and outside the doors of St. Matthew's Cathedral, the summer afternoon continued, horses and voices and the city's ordinary sounds moving forward into a future that had just changed its shape entirely, not with permission from anyone, but because the truth had arrived in a ruined veil and refused to leave. The cathedral did not empty. Eleanor had expected it to had expected the Whitmore family's social gravity to reassert itself the moment the immediate shock wore off, had expected people to find their coats and their carriages and their reasons to be elsewhere. That was what Boston's elite did when things became uncomfortable. They excused themselves with grace and discussed it later in safer rooms at a careful remove from the actual event. They stayed. Every single one of them. Judge Harold Prescott had not returned to his pew. He was standing near the chancel steps with Marshal Whitaker, speaking in the low, rapid tone of two men who have recognized each other as working in the same direction and are moving efficiently toward a shared conclusion. Eleanor caught Fragments Provenance Federal Record 18-9, the Madison Collection, and watched the judge's silver head incline toward the marshal's documentation with the focused attention of a man reading something that confirms a long-held suspicion. George Aldrich had moved from his position as Nathaniel's best man to a seat beside his wife in the third row. Margaret Aldrich's hand was over his. She was watching Eleanor with an expression that Eleanor could not immediately name, something between relief and a grief of its own, the look of a woman who had hoped for a particular outcome and is still deciding whether what actually happened was better or worse. Nathaniel had not moved. He was still standing in the center of the aisle, slightly behind Eleanor's position in the precise spot where he had received the answer that was not an answer from his sister. Eleanor was aware of him, the way she was aware of weather, not looking directly, but reading the pressure of his presence. He was a man standing in the ruins of a morning he hadn't understood when it began, and she found to her own exhausted surprise that she still felt something for him in that. Not the thing she had felt before. Not the thing that had sent her to Salem to pack her best work and her careful heart into a coach bound for Boston 2 years ago. But something. The residue of care does not clean up in a single afternoon. She turned away from it, She had other things to attend to. Marshal Whitaker came to her with her own satchel under his arm. His agent had retrieved it from the side door and delivered it with the careful handling of someone who had been told it mattered. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I'd like to go through this with you. Your documentation." "Of course," she said. He gestured toward a pew near the front, one of the box pews that lined the sides of the nave, slightly separated from the main congregation, enough privacy for a focused conversation. Eleanor sat. He sat across from her. His agent stood nearby. He opened the satchel and began removing the documents with the careful, systematic attention of a man whose entire professional life was built on the habit of understanding exactly what he had in front of him before he made any claim about it. He looked at the first photograph, the daguerreotype she had made on the first day of the restoration project, before she had touched a single thread. The veil in its original condition, fragile, aged, beautiful, in the way that old and careful things are beautiful, carrying in its construction the full evidence of the hands that had made it. He looked at it for a long time. "You made these yourself," he said. "I use a daguerreotype process I learned from a conservator in Philadelphia," Eleanor said. "It's standard practice in serious restoration work. You need a record of the object's condition before intervention, or you have no baseline to return to if something goes wrong." "And these are dated," he said. "Every one. The date, the time of day, the angle of light, the magnification if applicable. I keep a log for every session." He set down the photograph and looked at her. "Miss Brooks," he said, "how old are you?" 26, she said. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man recalibrating a prior assumption. "And you've been doing this work, conservation work, for how long?" "Since I was 17, she said. "My father was a carpenter. He understood that things needed care to last. He had a friend in Boston, a man who worked with historical furniture, who taught me the principles. The textile application I developed myself." She paused. "I'm told that's unusual." "I'd say that's an understatement," he said. He returned to the documents. Eleanor watched him work. He moved through the photographs and condition reports and session logs with increasing speed, not carelessness, but the quickening pace of a man who has found a thread and is following it with focused urgency toward wherever it leads. Then he reached the final pages. The notes she had added that morning in the bridal chamber after she had found the marking. The documentation of the marking itself, her notes on the thread, color, the stitch type, the size and spacing of the letters, the exact position along the inner hem. He read those pages twice. "This is when you found it," he said. "This morning," Eleanor said. "When I was arranging the fragments after." She paused. "After what happened? And you'd examined this section before, during the restoration." "I'd catalogued it," she said. "I noted the thread density as unusually high for that portion of the hem. I assumed it was a reinforcing technique. I chose not to disturb it because the section was structurally intact, and I follow a policy of minimum intervention. You don't touch what doesn't need touching." She looked at him. "I didn't see the letters until this morning, because this morning I was looking at the object in pieces, in direct summer light, at a specific angle I hadn't used before. The angle makes the difference. The letters are worked into the lace itself. They're not visible except under precise conditions. Deliberately concealed," Whitaker said. "Or deliberately preserved," Eleanor said carefully. "I don't know which. Maybe both." He looked at her with the particular attention of a man reassessing a conversation he thought he understood. "What do you mean?" he said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, organizing the way she always organized before she spoke on something she wasn't certain of. "Margaret Whitmore was a precise woman," she said. "I know that from her work. The construction of the veil, the stitch tension, the pattern choices, the structural decisions. They all speak to someone who was meticulous and deliberate, and who did not make accidental choices. If she worked letters into the inner hem at a specific thread density and in a specific position, she did it on purpose. She had a reason." Eleanor paused. "Her granddaughter said this morning that Margaret called the veil borrowed time." I think she knew exactly what she had. I think those letters were her way of making sure someone else would know it too, eventually. Whitaker sat back. For a moment, he was simply still looking at the documentation spread across the pew between them, and Eleanor could see him turning something over the weight of an interpretation he hadn't walked into this cathedral with. She was leaving a trail, he said finally. I think so, Eleanor said. I think she was a woman who couldn't return what she had, but couldn't rest with keeping it entirely secret. So she built the truth into the object itself and hoped someone with the right eyes would eventually find it. Another silence. You have the right eyes, Miss Brooks, Whitaker said. Eleanor didn't answer that. She looked at the photographs in the pew between them and thought of Margaret Whitmore's hands and what they had made and what they had hidden and what they had intended, and she felt again that complicated thing that was grief and anger and something like justice, all compressed into a single weight in her chest. What happens now? She asked. Doug. What happened now was this Judge Prescott approached the pew where Eleanor and the marshal were seated with the particular purposeful stride of a man who has reached a conclusion and is moving toward its implementation. Whitaker, he said. A word. The marshal stood. He and Prescott stepped a few feet away close enough that Eleanor could hear the general shape of the conversation, without the specific words, the deliberate courtesy of two officials who acknowledged her central role without quite including her in the formal proceeding. She sat in the pew and breathed. Around her, the cathedral had developed a new sound, the low sustained murmur of 60 people who have witnessed something significant and are in the process of deciding what they think about it. She could feel the social reckoning in progress the way she could always feel the shift in a room's temperature when public opinion was adjusting. These were people who had come this morning with a specific understanding of the Whitmore family, their wealth, their position, their unassailability, and they were now in the process of revising that understanding in real time. It was not a comfortable process for most of them. The Whitmore name had been useful to too many people in too many different ways for its sudden complication to be received with simple relief. But they were doing it. That was what mattered. From across the nave she became aware of a figure moving toward her, not Whitaker, not Prescott, not anyone she'd been tracking. She looked up. It was Mrs. Catherine Langley, a name Eleanor knew from Nathaniel's social calendar, the wife of Harrison Langley, one of Boston's most senior shipping merchants. A woman in her 60s, stout, with the particular manner of someone who has spent 40 years attending social events and has developed opinions about most things that she rarely shares and always means. Mrs. Langley sat down beside Eleanor without preliminary. I knew Margaret Whitmore, she said. Eleanor looked at her. Not well, Mrs. Langley continued. She wasn't a woman who allowed people to know her well. But I knew her. I was at her table 4 or 5 times over the years. She paused. She had extraordinary hands. You noticed them, the steadiness, the way she held things. A beat. She used to say that a woman's worth was in what she could build that lasted, not what she inherited, what she built. Eleanor was very still. She would have liked you, Mrs. Langley said. I want you to know that. It was such a simple thing to say. Such an uncomplicated and direct thing from a woman who had no reason to say it except that it was true, and she had decided Eleanor should hear it. Eleanor felt something move through her that she hadn't felt all day. Not relief, not vindication, but something more personal and more unexpected. The feeling of being seen. Not as a problem to be solved, or a threat to be managed, or an inconvenient truth to be accommodated. Just seen. Thank you, Eleanor said. Her voice came out slightly uneven. The only moment all day her voice had done that. Mrs. Langley patted her hand once with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has offered what she came to offer and doesn't require gratitude to be elaborate. Then she stood and went back to her seat. The conversation between Whitaker and Prescott concluded. They returned to Eleanor's pew together, a united front in the way that two men coming from different angles of the same institutional authority tend to become united when they've reached the same destination. Miss Brooks, Judge Prescott said, I want to be direct with you about what we're looking at. Please, she said. He sat across from her the way the marshal had with the documents between them. The Madison Collection, formerly the First Lady's Commission on Historical Domestic Textiles, 1809, included 47 individual items, catalogued before the collection was formally transferred to Federal Archive. Between 1810 and 1812, 11 of those items were reported as unaccounted for in the diplomatic language of the time. He paused. This veil was item number 7 on that list. The number landed with a specific weight. 7. Not an anonymous loss in a bureaucratic inventory. A specific thing specifically missing, specifically searched for, and not found. How did the Whitmore family acquire it? Eleanor asked. Prescott and Whitaker exchanged a glance, the glance of two men who have a theory they are not yet prepared to state as fact. That, Whitaker said, is what we'll be finding out. What I can tell you, Prescott said, is that under federal statute, the destruction of a recognized government heritage artifact is a serious matter, regardless of how the item came to be in private possession. He looked at her steadily. Your documentation establishes the object's condition before and after the act of destruction. It establishes the identity of the individuals who were present, and it establishes the provenance, marking that identifies the object's federal status. He paused. That is, Miss Brooks, an extraordinary piece of evidentiary work. I was restoring the object? Eleanor said. I simply kept records. You kept records that most trained archivists would not have kept with this degree of thoroughness, Whitaker said. There was something in his voice, not quite admiration, more like the specific respect of a professional encountering another professional's work and recognizing its quality. Where did you learn archival documentation practice? From a man named Joseph Harrington in Philadelphia, Eleanor said. He was the senior conservator at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania for 20 years. He believed that conservation without documentation was decoration, not preservation. She paused. He was right. Nathaniel came to find her at 3:15. The afternoon had moved in a direction no one had anticipated. The ceremony long abandoned, the wedding breakfast untouched in the Highfield kitchen. The carriages that had brought Boston's finest to celebrate a union, now waiting in various states of arrangement outside the cathedral, while their owners remained inside, unwilling to leave before the final shape of the afternoon became clear. Victoria and Caroline had been escorted to an anteroom by the marshal's agents. Not arrested, the marshal had been precise about that, for which Eleanor was grimly grateful, because she had no desire for the spectacle of a physical removal, only for the consequences to be what they were. They were being questioned. Statements were being taken. The full weight of what the morning's cruelty had uncovered was descending on them with the patient, methodical pressure of institutional authority, which was in many ways more thorough than any dramatic confrontation could have been. Nathaniel sat down beside Eleanor in the pew where she had remained since her conversation with the marshal. She had been alone for 15 minutes, which was the first time all day she had been alone without a task to perform, and she had used the time to sit with her hands folded and breathe and let herself feel without management whatever needed to be felt. He sat down, and for a moment he didn't speak. And she let him have that moment because she understood he was working toward something, and because there was no urgency left, only aftermath. I owe you an apology, he said finally. You do, she said. More than one, probably. Yes. He was quiet again. She could feel him organizing the way she organized, reaching for the precise words rather than the available ones. This morning, he said, when I came to your room, I said it didn't matter what I believed about the veil. You did. That was... He stopped. That was the worst thing I said to you. I want you to know I understand that now. It wasn't about the veil. It was about whether I was willing to stand in your corner when it cost something. And I wasn't. I'm not... He paused. I'm not going to make excuses for it. I just want you to know I understand what I did. Eleanor looked at him. She believed him. That was the complicated thing about Nathaniel Whitmore. He was a man capable of genuine understanding, capable of seeing his own failures clearly, once the moment of choice had passed, and the pressure of choosing was removed. He was thoughtful in retrospect in exactly the ways he was inadequate in real time. "I believe you," she said. "Eleanor." "Nathaniel." She turned to face him more fully. "What you understand doesn't change what happened, and what I've understood today." She paused. "What I've understood is that I spent 2 years believing that your decency in the quiet moments was the truest thing about you, that the difficulty you had in the hard moments was something that would change, that love could." She stopped. She started again. "I am not angry at you," she said. "I want to be honest about that because I think you expect me to be, and I think you're braced for it, and the truth is simpler and harder than anger. I'm not angry. I'm just—" She thought of the right word. "Finished. With this. With what we were trying to be." He closed his eyes. She watched him receive that the word land in him the way a stone lands in deep water, the surface disturbance, and then the long invisible drop. "I know," he said. "I know." He opened his eyes and looked at the altar, the summer flowers still arranged there with ceremony waiting for a moment that was not coming. "What will you do?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Something honest." It was Margaret Aldrich who told Eleanor about the second letter. She came to the pew at 3:30, while Nathaniel was speaking with Judge Prescott about the family's legal situation, and Eleanor was finally belatedly drinking the cup of tea that Reverend Coates had produced from somewhere in the cathedral's back rooms, and pressed into her hands with the manner of a man who has found that tea is the one offering appropriate to every human situation. Margaret sat down with the directness that Eleanor had come to appreciate as her consistent mode. No preamble, no social lubrication. "There's something you should know," Margaret said. Eleanor looked at her. "My husband," Margaret said, "before he left commerce for shipping, worked for 6 years as a secondary archivist at the Federal Records Office in Washington." She paused. "He knows people there. He's known for some time, years actually, that several items from the Madison collection were in private hands in New England. He didn't know which families. He didn't know which items." She looked at Eleanor carefully. "When William sent word this morning about your letter, about what you'd found, George sent a letter of his own. To Washington. To the director of Federal Archives." Eleanor set down her teacup. "He did this without telling me," Margaret continued with the specific tone of a wife who has made peace with a husband's habit of unilateral action. "But he did it. And I think you should know that what is happening in this room today is not going to end in this room. The federal interest in what you've found, the documentation, the provenance, the trail is going to be considerably larger than one afternoon in a Boston cathedral." Eleanor was quiet. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Margaret looked at her steadily. "Because you are 26 years old, and you have spent the day being very brave and very correct and very alone," she said. "And I think someone should tell you that what you've done today has a reach you cannot yet see, and that you should be prepared for that." A pause. "And because Margaret Whitmore, the other one, the old one, would have wanted someone to tell you." Eleanor felt it again, that same involuntary unsteadiness she'd felt when Mrs. Langley spoke to her. The particular vulnerability of being seen clearly by someone who has no obligation to look. She breathed through it. "What kind of reach?" she asked. "The federal government," Margaret said, "has been looking for the missing Madison collection pieces for 6 years. They have not found them because the people who had them were careful, and the institution doing the looking was not at that time in possession of documentation thorough enough to make a legal case." She paused. "Your 8 months of work changed that. For this piece, certainly. Possibly for others if the Whitmore family's acquisition trail leads where George suspects it leads." The implication of that settled over Eleanor slowly, the way a large and complicated thing settles when the mind is already tired, not all at once, but in stages, each one heavier than the last. The veil was one piece. 11 pieces had been reported missing. If the Whitmore family's connection ran deeper than a single inherited object, George thinks there are others, Eleanor said. "George thinks it's possible," Margaret said carefully. He is not certain, but he thinks the documentation you have, the provenance trail you've established, may be the first clean thread anyone has been able to pull. Marshal Whitaker found Eleanor 20 minutes later when the cathedral had taken on the quality of late afternoon and the shadows through the tall windows had shifted to something longer and more golden than the white summer midday light. He came to her directly, which she appreciated. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I've been in contact with my office. There are some things I need to tell you." She stood. "Go ahead." "The veil is going to be taken into federal custody today," he said, "along with your documentation. All of it, the photographs, the condition reports, the session logs. Everything in the satchel." He paused. "I want you to understand that this is being treated as primary evidence in a federal proceeding. Your work, every page of it, is going to be examined by the federal archivist's office." "I understand," she said. "There's a second thing." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "This is a formal request issued by my office with the endorsement of Judge Prescott, asking you to remain available for consultation during the course of the federal investigation." He held it out. "It's not a legal requirement, it's a request, but it's a serious one." Eleanor took the document. She unfolded it and read it, all of it, carefully, because she had learned from her father that you always read the whole of a document before you respond to any part of it. It was, as he had described, a request. Formal, official, signed and dated. Her name was in it, not as a witness, not as a complainant, but as a consulting expert. A conservator of record. She had never been called a conservator of record by anyone except herself. "What would consultation involve?" she asked. "Analysis of any other objects that come to our attention through this investigation," Whitaker said. "Your expertise in identifying provenance markers, the methods you use, the documentation practices, that's not something most people working in Federal Archive have encountered in practice. It's valuable." He paused. "Potentially very valuable, depending on where this investigation leads." Eleanor folded the document. She thought about Salem. She thought about her father's workshop and her mother's schoolroom, and the long, patient years of building a skill that the world had mostly not yet found a category for. She thought about 8 months of work with a magnifying glass and a lamp, and hands trained to be steady. She thought about Margaret Whitmore, precise and careful, and hiding a truth in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right eyes. She looked at Whitaker. "I'll need to return to Salem first," she said. "I have equipment there, reference materials. I'll need to collect them if I'm going to be of any real use to you." The ghost of something crossed Whitaker's face, not quite a smile, but its functional equivalent. The expression of a man whose day had required him to enter a wedding and had resulted in something considerably more useful than a wedding. "That can be arranged," he said. "I'll send an agent with you for the transport." "That won't be necessary," Eleanor said. "Miss Brooks." "I've been moving my own equipment for 9 years without an escort," she said pleasantly. "I'll manage." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I reckon you will." She went to find William before she left. He was in the vestibule, had stationed himself there sometime in the afternoon, in the way of a man who has decided he is part of this proceeding and is not going to be peripheral to it. He was talking to Della when Eleanor found them, his voice low, the conversation clearly about the events of the day and their implications for the people who worked the Whitmore estate. He saw Eleanor coming and straightened. "Miss Brooks," he said. "William!" She stopped in front of him. "You went with Della this morning. You got the letter through." "Yes, ma'am." "And you sent word to George Aldrich." A pause. "I did." "Why?" she asked, not accusatory, genuinely curious, the same curiosity she brought to everything she didn't yet understand. William was quiet for a moment. He adjusted his hat brim in the way she had come to recognize as his thinking gesture. 30 years with the Whitmore family," he said. "You see things in 30 years. You know things. And there are things you know that you can't do anything with because you're the groundskeeper and they're the family, and that's the shape of the world." He paused. "But this morning the shape changed. And when the shape changes, a man either moves with it or he don't." He looked at her steadily. I moved with it. Eleanor held out her hand. He looked at it. Then he took it with the careful grip of a man who is not accustomed to this particular gesture, but understands its weight. Thank you, she said. For the South Gate. For Della. For Aldrich. She paused. For all of it. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. She let go of his hand. She turned toward the cathedral doors. Della appeared at her elbow, young and wide-eyed, and still holding Eleanor's letter, which she had apparently carried all the way to State Street and all the way back without relinquishing. Ma'am, Della said, holding it out. The marshal said you'd want this back. Eleanor looked at the letter. Her own handwriting on the outside, quick and precise. The letter of a woman who had made a decision in a bridal chamber on the morning of her ruined wedding and had acted on it before she could reconsider. She took it. She folded it and put it in her pocket. She would keep it. Not as a trophy, she had no interest in trophies, but as a record. Because she had been a keeper of records all her life, and this letter was part of the record of this day, and this day had been the most important day of her life so far, and she was not going to lose any piece of it to carelessness or sentiment. She pushed open the doors of St. Matthew's Cathedral. The summer afternoon light hit her full in the face, warm and white, and completely indifferent to everything that had happened inside those walls in the last 2 hours. Boston moved around her, the way cities always move forward without waiting, without accommodation. The ordinary machinery of a summer afternoon continuing its business, regardless of the extraordinary things happening at its edges. Eleanor stood on the cathedral steps and breathed the outdoor air. She was not the woman who had arrived at those steps 3 hours ago. She was not the woman who had climbed into a hired carriage at Highfield Manor with a bundled veil and a satchel of documentation, and a decision made not from certainty, but from the simple, exhausted recognition that someone had to do this, and it was going to be her. She was still herself. Thomas Brooks's daughter. Margaret Brooks's daughter, a carpenter and a schoolteacher's child, who had spent her life building skills the world hadn't yet decided how to value. But she was also now a conservator of record in a federal proceeding. She was also the woman who had walked into a cathedral with a destroyed veil and walked out with the truth intact. She was also, she thought, just barely beginning to understand the size of what the next chapter of her life was going to be. She went down the steps into the summer afternoon. She had a journey to make, equipment to collect, work to do. The truth, once you had told it, did not leave you alone. It simply showed you what came next. The road to Salem took 4 hours on a good summer day. Eleanor had made the journey enough times to know its rhythms, the way the city thinned gradually into smaller roads, the particular sounds of a coach moving from cobblestone to packed earth, the quality of the air changing as Boston fell behind and the coast came nearer. She had made it happy, made it anxious, made it in the early hours of morning when she'd received news of a commission, made it in the slow grief of her father's last illness 3 years ago. She had never made it quite like this. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her satchel at her feet and her father's letter against her heart in her pocket, and she let the motion of the coach do what motion always did. Shake loose the things that stillness held in place. Let the day's events settle into their actual shape, rather than the shape urgency had imposed on them. Victoria's face when the marshal walked in. The specific sound of Caroline's involuntary breath when Eleanor said the word marking. Nathaniel standing in the center aisle of St. Matthew's with the expression of a man realizing the house he lived in had been built on ground he had never once inspected, and beneath all of it, persistent as a thread running through a complex weave, Margaret Whitmore's hands. The veil she had made. The letters she had stitched into the inner hem of a federal artifact and left there for 50 years, waiting for eyes careful enough to find them. Eleanor understood her now in a way she hadn't that morning. She had thought in the early months of the Restoration that she was coming to know Margaret through her craft, through the evidence of skill and intention that every maker leaves in the things they make. And she had. But the marking was something different. The marking was not craft. It was conscience. The deliberate preservation of a truth that could not be spoken aloud, hidden in a place where only the most patient and attentive hands would ever find it. Margaret Whitmore had known exactly what she had known it was wrong to keep it, had been unable for reasons Eleanor could construct, but not confirm the complicated reasons of a woman living inside a family and a society that did not offer her clean options to do the correct thing directly. And so she had done the next best thing. She had made the truth findable. She had trusted across decades that someone would eventually look closely enough. Eleanor had looked closely enough. She pressed her hand against the letter in her pocket and thought about what it meant to be trusted by someone you had never met across 50 years of silence through the medium of a stitched marking in deteriorating lace. It meant something. She wasn't yet sure of all the ways it meant something, but she knew it did. She closed her eyes. She slept for the first time in 20 hours. Salem in the summer evening smelled of salt water and warm timber, and the particular domestic combination of cook fires and garden herbs that meant home to Eleanor in a way no Boston parlor ever had or ever would. The coach left her at the corner of her street. She walked the last quarter mile with her satchel and her thoughts. And when she turned the corner and saw the front of her house, the small, well-kept house her parents had shared for 30 years, and that had come to her when her mother followed her father 2 winters ago, something in her chest released with a finality she hadn't been expecting. She was home. Not temporarily. Not between one chapter and the next. Home. She had spent 2 years orienting herself toward Boston, toward Highfield, toward the life she was supposed to be building in Nathaniel Whitmore's world. She saw now with the clarity that distance and disaster both provide that she had been trying to transplant herself into soil that was never going to take. You could not grow a person like Eleanor Brooks in marble halls and inherited silver. You could dress her for it. You could teach her the social vocabularies. You could even convince her for a while that she was putting down roots. But a woman who spent her life restoring broken things always knew at some level the difference between a thing that was genuinely healing and a thing that was being held together from the outside. She had been held together from the outside for 2 years. She unlocked her front door and went inside. The letter from Washington arrived 3 weeks later. She had been back in her workroom when it came the small room at the back of the house that her father had built with extra north-facing windows, because she had told him at 14 that conservators needed specific light, and he had listened, the way he always listened, with the complete attention of a man who took what his daughter said seriously. She was working on a commission that had come in before the Whitmore Restoration, a set of early colonial baptismal textiles from a congregation in Newburyport, and she had been grateful for the work's demand on her hands and eyes because hands occupied and eyes focused left less room for the kind of thinking that doesn't help. She had been thinking anyway. About Nathaniel. Not with grief exactly, she had been honest with herself about that much. What she felt for Nathaniel Whitmore now was something closer to a completed understanding than an ongoing wound. She saw him clearly, his genuine intelligence, his real decency in the quiet moments, his fundamental inability to spend his social capital on anything that cost him with his family. She did not hate him. She did not miss him in the way that suggested she had been wrong to walk away. She missed occasionally the version of him she had believed in during the first 6 months, the man she had thought he was before she learned how he behaved when things were actually hard. That was the thing about loss, she had decided. You didn't just lose the person. You lost the particular version of yourself that had existed in relation to them. The Eleanor who had believed Nathaniel Whitmore was the kind of man who would stand in her corner when it mattered that Eleanor was gone. What remained was someone who knew better. That was not, she had decided, a smaller thing to be. She heard the knock at the front door and set down her needle and went to answer it. The man on her doorstep was young mid-20s, neatly dressed in the manner of a government clerk, with the anxious punctuality of someone who has been given an important errand and is aware of its importance. "Miss Eleanor Brooks," he said. "Yes." He held out a sealed envelope. Heavy paper government seal, the federal seal, not a state office. "Delivered directly from Washington, ma'am, by order of the Director of Federal Archives." Eleanor took the envelope. "Thank you," she said. She closed the door. She stood in her hallway and looked at the envelope for a moment without opening it. Then she went back to her workroom. She sat at her bench under the north-facing windows. She set the envelope in the clear space beside her current project. She looked at them both, the delicate colonial textile, with its patient damage, the envelope with its weighty seal, and she thought, not for the first time, about the strange courses that a life could take when you stopped trying to steer it toward what you'd decided it should be, and simply attended carefully to what was actually in front of you. She broke the seal. She read the letter 3 times, because the first time her mind moved too fast, and the second time she wanted to be certain she had the specific language correct, and the third time because she wanted to feel the full weight of it before she responded. Then she set it down on her bench. The letter informed her in the formal, precise language of federal institutional communication, which she found she was able to read fluently, because formal and precise was the only language she had ever fully trusted that the investigation initiated following the events of August 14th at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Boston had expanded significantly. That the documentation she had provided had been examined by 3 senior federal archivists and had been determined to constitute the most thorough provenance record in the government's possession for any item from the Madison collection. That based on leads generated by the Whitmore family's statements and the acquisition trail her documentation had opened, 4 additional missing pieces from the 1809 collection had been identified in various New England private collections. That federal proceedings were ongoing, and she might be called upon as an expert witness. And at the bottom of the letter, in a paragraph that the director had apparently added in his own hand because the penmanship shifted slightly from the bureaucratic precision above it, that the federal government wished to offer her a formal position. Not a consultation, not a one-time engagement, a position, a title, a salary named in the letter in a specific annual amount that was she calculated nearly 3 times what her best commission year had ever produced. Senior Conservator Federal Heritage Textile Commission, a position the letter noted that did not currently exist. That was being created in response to the events of August 14th and the evident gap in federal capability they had exposed. That would be based partly in Washington and partly in the field, traveling to examine collections as leads emerged. That would require her to build from the ground up a documentation practice and a set of conservation standards for federal textile heritage. That would require, in short, everything she knew how to do. Eleanor sat at her bench under the north-facing windows and read the letter a 4th time. Then she got up and made tea. She wrote back to Washington that afternoon. Not immediately, not in the first flush of a feeling she hadn't yet fully examined. She had learned from her father that you didn't commit to a thing until you understood the grain of it, and she needed 2 cups of tea and a walk around her garden and a long sit at her workroom bench, staring at the Newburyport textiles before she understood the grain of this. What she understood was she wanted it. Not with the complicated, qualified wanting that she had brought to Boston, to Highfield, to the idea of becoming a Whitmore. A clean wanting. The wanting of a person who has been offered the precise thing they were built for and knows it immediately. What she also understood was it was frightening. Not the work, she was not afraid of the work. The work was the least frightening thing in her life. What was frightening was the scale of it, the visibility, the fact that she would be building something that didn't exist yet in a context federal government Washington official capacity that had never, as far as she could determine, employed a woman in this kind of role before. She would be the first. She sat with that for a while. Then she thought about Margaret Whitmore, who had stitched a truth into the hem of a veil, because the direct path was closed to her and had trusted the future to produce someone capable of finding it. And she thought about her mother, who had taught school in Salem for 20 years, and had never once in Eleanor's memory apologized for knowing more than the room expected her to know. And she thought about her father, who had built a workshop with north-facing windows for a 14-year-old girl's specific requirements without asking whether that was practical. She picked up her pen. She wrote a reply that was 4 sentences long because 4 sentences was what the situation required, and she did not waste words. She accepted the position. She stated her terms. She had terms specific and reasonable regarding her equipment, her travel conditions, and her right to publish her methods as a contribution to the broader field of conservation practice. She stated that she would arrive in Washington in 6 weeks, which was the time she needed to complete her current commission and put her Salem affairs in order. She sealed the letter. She sent it that afternoon. Marshal Whitaker came to Salem 2 weeks after the letter. She had not expected him had expected if there was further direct contact, that it would be through official correspondence, the formal channels of a federal proceeding. When he knocked on her door on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hand, and the unhurried manner of a man who has made a deliberate trip, she was surprised enough that she stood in the doorway for a moment before remembering her manners. "Marshal Whitaker," she said. "Come in." He came in. He looked around her workroom with the focused attention she had come to recognize as his characteristic mode of observation. Taking inventory, building an understanding, doing the thing he did, which was seeing things as they actually were, rather than as he'd been told to expect them. She set her work down and made tea. He sat at the work table. She had cleared a space automatically, the hospitality of a person accustomed to working alone, but not unaccustomed to visitors. And he held his cup with both hands, and looked at the Newburyport textiles laid out in their documentation grid. "You've been working," he said. "I don't stop," she said. "It helps me think." "What are you thinking about?" She looked at him. "Washington," she said. "The new position, what it will require." "That's why I came," he said. He set down his cup and reached into his coat and produced a folded document, thicker than the one he'd handed her in the cathedral, and she could see from the weight of it that it was not a single sheet, but several. "The investigation has moved faster than we expected," he said. "The Whitmore family's cooperation, which is to say the cooperation their lawyer advised them to provide, has given us a clearer picture of the acquisition chain." He unfolded the documents. The veil was not the only piece that passed through the Whitmore estate. "We've confirmed 3 others, and the chain goes beyond the Whitmore family. There are at least 2 other New England families involved, and we believe the original point of acquisition was a single agent who worked briefly as a federal records clerk in 1810. Eleanor went still. "The entire collection's dispersal was deliberate," she said. "We believe so," Whitaker said. "Not random disappearance. Coordinated removal and distribution to private collections where the pieces would be absorbed into family inheritance and become over time simply furniture." Simply furniture. The phrase hit her with a specific force, the particular outrage of a conservator, which was not abstract or institutional, but personal. Things that had been made with skill and intention and care, reduced to background, made invisible by proximity, stolen not dramatically, but gradually through the patient erosion of context. "How many pieces?" she asked. "From the 1809 collection 11 originally reported missing. We've now confirmed the location of 6. He looked at her. "We believe the remaining 5 are still in private hands somewhere in New England, possibly further afield." He paused. "We need someone who knows how to look." Eleanor understood. This was not just a consultation, not just the position in the letter. He was telling her that the work was larger than Washington had initially represented, and that he wanted her to understand the full scale of it before she committed to walking through that door. She respected him for that. "You came to tell me in person," she said. "I did," he said simply. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because when I walked into that cathedral," he said, "I walked in expecting to retrieve an artifact and document a family's misconduct. I did not expect—" He paused, choosing carefully. "I did not expect to find someone who had already done better work with fewer resources than my office has managed in 6 years of looking." He looked at her steadily. That deserved a personal conversation. Eleanor set down her own cup. She looked at the Newburyport textiles, at the north-facing windows, at the workroom her father had built for her specific requirements. She was going to miss this room. She was going to miss Salem, the salt smell, the sound of the harbor, the particular quality of the light on a winter morning. She was going to miss the small-known life she had built here with careful hands over 26 years. She was also going to go. Some things you knew with your whole self and did not need to argue yourself into. "Tell me about the other 5 pieces," she said. Whitaker allowed himself for the first time in her experience of him a full and genuine smile. It changed his face considerably, made him look younger, made the professional gravity drop away for a moment into something more human and more relieved. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. He stayed for 3 hours. They spread his documents across her work table alongside her own, the federal records and acquisition chains beside the conservation logs and provenance notes. And they worked through what was known and what was not, the confirmed and the suspected, the threads that led somewhere clear, and the ones that disappeared into the gaps that 6 years of incomplete searching had left. Eleanor asked questions. He answered them. She made notes in the precise, dated, systematic way she made all her notes. He watched her work with the attention of someone observing a method they recognize as superior to their own and are learning in real time. At some point, Della's name came up, the Whitmore housemaid who had carried Eleanor's letter through the orchard and into the world. "She's been discharged," Eleanor said, not asking. She had assumed. "Yes," Whitaker said. "The Whitmore household is complicated at present. Several of the staff have left." "Where is she?" "I don't know." Eleanor set down her pen. "Find out," she said. "Please. If she needs a reference, I'll provide one." She showed more courage on that morning than most of the people in that cathedral. Whitaker looked at her. "I'll find out," he said. He found out. Della had gone to her aunt's house in Cambridge, was looking for work, had been given a cold reference by the Whitmore household that reflected the family's current attitude toward anyone they perceived as having contributed to their difficulties. 2 weeks later, Eleanor wrote a letter of reference for Della that was 2 pages long and described her courage and discretion and reliability in terms that any employer who read it carefully would understand immediately. She sent it with a note to Margaret Aldrich, who had connections in Cambridge, asking if she could see that it reached the right hands. Margaret could. It did. Della was employed within the month by a family in Cambridge who treated her by all accounts with simple and uncomplicated respect. Eleanor never heard directly from Della about any of this. She didn't need to. She knew what she had done and why she had done it, and that was sufficient. The morning she left for Washington was a Tuesday in early October. The summer had given way in the weeks since August to the particular New England fall that always felt to Eleanor like the year taking a breath, the colors coming into the trees, the air sharpening, the quality of the light shifting toward something more horizontal and more serious. She had always loved this season. It was the season of clear-sightedness, she thought. The season when the world stopped pretending it was something other than what it was. She was taking 1 trunk and 2 satchels. Everything else she was leaving in Salem, the house properly closed, the garden put up, arrangements made with a neighbor to look in. She had kept her conservation tools and her reference library and her personal documentation of every project she had worked on in 9 years of practice. Everything else was furniture. She had one last thing to do before she locked the front door. She went into her workroom. On the bench in the center of the cleared space, she had placed the letter from Washington, the original one with the director's handwritten paragraph at the bottom, naming the position that had not existed before she existed to fill it. And beside it, the letter she had sent to State Street on the morning of August 14th, retrieved from her pocket at the end of that day and kept in the drawer of her bench since. She looked at them both. Then she added a third document. The first page of her session log from the Whitmore Vale restoration, dated November 1814. The first day she had spread the veil across her work table and begun the slow, careful process of understanding what she had been given. Her handwriting at the top of the page, Object Honiton Lace Veil, attributed Whitmore family, estimated construction, 1760 to 1775. Condition on receipt, significant deterioration. Multiple areas of thread loss, structural instability throughout. Conservation approach, minimum intervention document. All decisions preserve original maker's intent wherever possible. Preserve original maker's intent. She had written that on the first day, without knowing yet anything about Margaret Whitmore, except the evidence of her hands. She had followed that principle through 8 months of careful work. And she had followed it, she understood now, right into the cathedral, and through everything that had happened there. Preserve original maker's intent. Margaret had made the veil to last. She had built truth into it because she believed truth should last. And Eleanor had preserved both the craft and the conscience, the beauty and the confession in the only way she knew how, which was to attend to what was actually there with the full force of her training and her patience and her refusal to look away. She folded all 3 documents together. She put them in the inner pocket of her traveling coat against her chest, where the August letter had ridden through the entire day of the cathedral. She walked out of her workroom. She locked the front door of the Salem house. She picked up her satchels and walked to where the coach was waiting. She was 2 hours south of Salem, in the slow autumn rhythm of a long journey's early hours, when she allowed herself to think about what she was actually going toward. Not the position she had thought about that enough in the 6 weeks since the letter, that she had worn the thinking smooth, turned it over until its edges were familiar. She knew what the work was. She was ready for the work. She was thinking about something Margaret Aldrich had said to her on their last meeting 3 days ago in Boston, over tea in the Aldrich parlor, with George Aldrich making periodic appearances from his study to add observations neither woman had asked for, and both of them had tolerated with good humor. Margaret had said, "You're going to spend the next years of your life finding things that have been hidden and returning them to where they belong. Do you know what that requires? Skill," Eleanor had said, "patience, good documentation." Those, Margaret had agreed. And one thing more. She had looked at Eleanor over her teacup with the expression of a woman saying something she had been thinking about for a while. You have to be willing to love the work more than you love the result. Because the result is always incomplete. You'll find 5 of the 11 pieces, and there will be 6 you never find. You'll document a provenance trail that leads all the way back to the truth, and then something will happen, and the truth will get buried again under a legal proceeding, or a family's obstructions, or simple time. She paused. The only thing that's fully yours is the work itself, the attending, the not looking away. Eleanor had sat with that. She was sitting with it now in the October coach south toward Washington, with 3 documents against her heart and 9 years of practice in her satchels. The only thing that's fully yours is the work itself. She understood that. Had understood it probably since she was 17, and her father's friend had first put a damaged textile in her hands and said, "Here is what it was. Here is what it is. Now, see if you can help it find its way back." She had been helping broken things find their way back ever since. That was not a small thing. It was not a consolation prize for the life she had not had. It was not the lesser option, the alternative to something better. It was the work she was made for. And she was going to Washington to do it. The investigation ran for 2.5 years. In that time, Eleanor Brooks documented 9 of the 11 missing pieces from the 1809 Madison collection. She developed the provenance methodology that Whitaker had recognized in her work at St. Matthew's into a formal system, a set of standards and practices that she published at her own insistence in a monograph distributed to historical societies and conservation organizations throughout the eastern states. She trained 3 other conservators in her documentation approach. She testified in 2 federal proceedings, both times as an expert witness, both times effectively enough that Judge Prescott wrote her a personal note after the second case, saying simply, "Your mother was right to teach you how to fill a room with your voice." She found the 9th piece on a rainy afternoon in a private collection in Newport, Rhode Island, a length of decorative trim that had been incorporated without anyone's apparent awareness of what it was into a set of drawing room curtains. She documented it with the same photographs and condition reports and session notes she had applied to everything else, and she packed it carefully for transport to Washington. And she sat for a moment in the Newport collector's front parlor after the removal was complete. The collector, a man in his 70s who had inherited the curtains along with the house, sat across from her with the expression of someone who has just learned that his drawing room drapes were a federal artifact. "I had no idea," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "Most people don't. That's why the work matters." She went home to her Washington rooms that evening. She had rented a house on a street of modest but well-kept properties that suited her practically and not at all socially, which she found she preferred to the reverse, and she made tea and sat at her work table, and opened her project log, and wrote the date and the location and the object number. 9 of 11. She sat with that for a while. 2 still out there. 2 still in someone's home, or someone's storage, or someone's attic incorporated into furniture, or wrapped in storage cloths, or perhaps already damaged beyond recognition. She couldn't know. Might never know. The trail on the remaining 2 was cold and showed no signs of warming. 2 she might never find. She thought about Margaret Whitmore, who had hidden a truth for 50 years, trusting that eventually someone would look. She thought about all the things that had ever been hidden and waited and never found by the right hands. She wrote in her log, remaining 2 items. Investigation ongoing. Work continues. She closed the log. She put the kettle back on. She had a new commission starting in the morning, a collection of early federal period domestic textiles from a private donor in Philadelphia, the first bequest to the Federal Commission from a private individual since the investigation had become public knowledge. People were paying attention. People were beginning to understand that the things they had in their homes had histories and that histories required tending. That was something. Not everything. Not the clean, complete resolution that the world liked to offer up in its stories, but something real and solid and growing, the way all genuine things grew, not overnight, not dramatically, but through accumulated patient attention, one careful decision at a time. Outside her Washington window, the October city moved through its evening voices and horses, and the particular sound of a capital city that was still in 1817, in the early stages of understanding what it was going to become. Eleanor Brooks sat at her work table, with her tea and her open log, and her 9 documented pieces of a collection that had been stolen and scattered and partially reclaimed, and she thought about the woman in Massachusetts who had stitched a secret into a hem and trusted the future. She thought about her father's hands, and her mother's voice, and a bridal chamber where scissors had hit the floor. She thought about the size of what one woman could do when she refused to look away, and she understood with the complete bone-deep certainty that only comes to people who have found the work they were built for, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because the road had been kind, not because she had been given what she deserved or protected from what she hadn't, but because she had attended carefully and without flinching to what was actually in front of her. Because she had kept records. Because she had preserved original maker's intent in everything she touched, including the life she was making. Eleanor Brooks had walked into a ruined vale and found her way forward. She had not been saved by love or rescued by fortune or handed an ending that required nothing of her. She had done the work. And the work, it turned out, was the most permanent thing in the world, more permanent than marble halls or inherited silver or the social standing of families who had spent generations confusing possession with worth. What you built with your own hands, with patience and precision, and the refusal to pretend that broken things were whole that lasted. That was what Margaret Whitmore had known. That was what Eleanor Brooks had proven. And that was the truth that no pair of scissors in any summer, in any year, could ever cut apart.